I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule, they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. A phone call tore through the early morning darkness, jolting me awake. The clock read 4:52, a time far too early for a reasonable conversation, especially with an unknown number. A woman's raspy voice greeted me on the other end, pronouncing my name with indifference, as if reading it from a script. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. You have been selected to participate in the Federal Urban Safety Control Program," she said, her tone flat and lifeless. Rubbing my eyes, I struggled to focus, asking what she wanted from me. "You filed a complaint about a malfunctioning traffic light at the intersection of 12th and Brand Street a few months ago, correct?" She clearly knew the answer, as if she held my file in front of her. The voice on the line was low, invasive, and brooked no argument. "Yes, I did," I mumbled, unsure why this had to disturb my morning peace. "What now?" "I thought it was already handled. The light has been repaired, Mr. Brooks, but your complaint automatically registered you for our community oversight program. You are required to attend a special meeting to discuss safety at transportation hubs related to this complaint. We expect your presence this evening." "Wait, but..." I tried to protest, to explain that this wasn't in my plans, that I had work, and how my complaint about a traffic light could have escalated into something so mandatory. But she cut me off. "You are obligated, Mr. Brooks. Non-participation in the program may result in penalties. This is your duty to society and federal law. The meeting location has already been sent to your phone." A heavy knot formed in my stomach. They were pressing me as if this were a court, where I had no right to argue. A sense of unease slowly filled my mind, making me wonder where the hell they wanted to send me. A short beep sounded. I glanced at the screen and saw a message with an address. Some town I'd never heard of, something like Elm Hollow, deep in the backwoods, almost bordering a forest. It seemed there was an abandoned factory there once. "The highway is closed, Mr. Brooks." Her voice continued dryly, as if reading my mind. "Last year's flood damaged a significant part of the road, and the local budget lacks funds for repairs, so the only way to reach the location is on our special night train. The schedule has already been coordinated. It departs exactly at 9:30 p.m. She seemed to know everything she could know about my plans, my routine. She even seemed to know I had no grounds for objection. I frowned, suppressing the urge to just tell her off, but something inside trembled. A paralyzing fear clung to each of her words. I couldn't understand why this call weighed on me so heavily. "Listen," I began, but her voice grew firmer. "Instructions have already been sent to you, Mr. Brooks. This is your civic duty. Your refusal will be considered a violation of current law and will result in appropriate measures. As a conscious citizen and a true American, you are required to respond to the call in this challenging time for the country. We'll see you there." After a brief tone, I was left sitting on the bed, slowly gathering my thoughts. The entire day passed in a haze. The strange call nagged at me, and the feeling that someone was forcing me into this was unbearable. I desperately wanted to stay home, but the prospect of fines and potential legal trouble weighed heavily on my decision. I decided to go, despite the dull foreboding that tightened around my throat with every step I took toward the train. The anxiety didn't let up as I made my way to the station. The platform was eerily quiet. Heavy clouds poured rain onto the ground. The station, usually filled with noisy crowds, was almost deserted. Just a few staff members loitered lazily. Through a thick veil of steam, I saw a dark train, old-fashioned, as if stuck in another era, and felt a chill run down my spine. This was not what I expected. Not a standard commuter train, but something strange, unfriendly, smelling of rancid diesel and burnt tar. Even the windows looked sinister, coated in a hazy film that blocked the light, hiding the interior from prying eyes. I glanced at my watch. Exactly 9:28. There was hardly any time left, so I hurried onto the train, feeling an inexorable, ominous anticipation with each step. As soon as I stepped over the threshold, the doors behind me hissed shut. Inside was almost as quiet as outside. The car was empty, as if I were the only passenger, but the air was thick with a stale, musty odor, a blend of dust and something old, long forgotten. I paused for a moment, looking around, and noticed another unsettling detail. Every seat, one after another, was neatly covered but layered with a fine film of dust, as though no one had sat there for months. I moved forward, found my seat, and sat down, trying not to breathe too deeply to avoid inhaling the suffocating smell. Outside, the muffled noise of the station still echoed, and I suddenly realized we hadn't moved yet. A few minutes passed. The sound of the engine grew louder, but the train remained stationary. Suddenly, an announcement blared overhead. The train to Elm Hollow departs in 2 minutes. Please ensure you are seated. The voice was metallic and completely devoid of emotion, but there was something odd about it, almost rehearsed, as if it had been replayed over and over. A shiver ran through me, but I tried to keep calm. After all, it was just a train ride. As the train finally started moving, I stared out the windows, trying to make out where exactly we were headed. A thick fog obscured everything but the dim glow of streetlights, which gradually disappeared as we left the station. Soon there was nothing, only darkness enveloping the carriage. Outside, not a single light, no glimmer, just the heavy gray fog and the oppressive blackness pressing in from all sides. I tried to lean back in my seat and relax, but the feeling of unease wouldn't let go. The woman's voice still echoed in my ears, her menacing tone, that strange insistence. Why me? Why this old train? This eerie station, and a place I'd never even heard of? Perhaps 10 minutes passed, and the darkness outside grew even thicker. I closed my eyes, attempting to shake off my anxious thoughts. But then I felt the train begin to slow down. In a moment, it came to a complete stop. The doors hissed quietly, and the sound of footsteps followed. Slow, deliberate steps echoed somewhere behind me, where I could see no one and nothing. With each step, the air grew denser, and I felt beads of cold sweat trickling down my back. I thought it could be the conductor, maybe someone else, but there was something wrong in that sound. The footsteps were uneven, with a faint limp, and I had the unsettling feeling that someone or something was struggling forward with great effort. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to turn around. I looked at the seats around me, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone, but the carriage was empty. Not a single passenger, just the echo of footsteps, a rhythm getting closer and closer. I began nervously clenching and unclenching my fists, feeling my nails dig into my palms, but it was the only way to keep my composure. When the footsteps reached a point almost directly behind me, there was suddenly absolute silence. No sound, no hint of movement. I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next, and finally, unable to stand it any longer, I slowly turned around. Behind me, nothing, just empty rows of seats, dimly lit by the dull yellow glow of old lamps. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head, that maybe I'd been so tense from that strange call and the eerie carriage that I'd imagined it all. But when I turned back to the window, barely stifling a gasp, I saw a woman sitting across from me. Her face was pale, almost deathly white, but her eyes shone with an unnatural brightness. She sat upright, her hands clasped on her lap, her gaze fixed directly on me. "You should have stayed home," she said softly, but her words felt like a blow to my head. I was forced," I stammered, barely believing I was responding to this strange apparition. Where had she come from? How had she sat down so silently? She shook her head, slowly and stiffly, as if her neck were unyielding. "No one forced you. You made your choice. Now you're here, and you need to understand. This train is no ordinary train." She fell silent, and in that silence, heavy and ominous, I heard something I hadn't noticed before, a deep, rhythmic sound coming from within the train, as if it were breathing, like a living being. "Who are you?" My voice sounded pitiful, barely recognizable to myself. She stared at me for a few more seconds, as if assessing me. Her lips trembled as she began to speak again. "You will not get off at a normal station, Mr. Brooks. This train is heading somewhere you didn't choose. But now you're part of its journey." She fell silent, her face contorting with a strange expression. Pain, perhaps, or hatred, before she vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. I blinked and looked around. An empty carriage, no trace that anyone had been sitting there. Only my own petrified reflection staring back from the window. It took me a few moments to regain my composure, but as I glanced around once more, I saw something outside that made my blood run cold. Dark, pitch-black fog thickened around us, veiling anything that could serve as a landmark. In that dense fog, shadowy shapes flitted about, vague, indistinct forms, moving almost imperceptibly. I couldn't tear my eyes away, as if mesmerized by this strange sight, until I realized the faces, or what might be faces, were turned toward me. Someone's knock echoed from the door of the carriage. The sound was muffled but heavy, as though someone or something was beating against the door from the other side, trying to get in. I instinctively shrank back, trying not to betray my fear, not to draw attention, though it seemed pointless in such empty silence. A surge of panic shot through me, and I leapt up, deciding to leave this carriage, to find other passengers or a conductor. Maybe I was just tired, and all this seemed real because of the stress from that strange call. But the longer I looked around, the clearer it became that I was truly alone here. In the doorway between the carriages, I hesitated, pressing my hand against the handle. There was an odd sensation, as though the door itself resisted, as though it was holding me back with its cold, metallic touch. But finally, I pulled it open and stepped into the next carriage. A strange feeling swept over me immediately. The smell in this carriage was even worse. The air heavy, stale, suffocating, with an unpleasant hint of moisture and something sour. I moved forward along the rows of empty seats, but the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. It felt like something was watching me, perhaps lurking somewhere in the darkness beyond the window, like the shadows I'd seen earlier. Then I saw the first sign. On one of the seats, a little farther down the aisle, lay a torn ticket. Its edges were wet, as if someone had been caught in the rain and discarded it in frustration. Turning my head, I noticed another mark, a dark stain on the floor leading farther into the carriage. It seemed as if someone had dragged something heavy, leaving wet marks along the aisle, and for a moment, a chill swept over me as I realized it might be blood. I couldn't stop. I moved forward, step by step, until I stumbled upon an even stranger sight. A few bags left right on the seats, as if their owners had disappeared in haste, abandoning their belongings. One bag was open, with a few toys poking out, a colorful teddy bear, a doll with tangled hair, a handful of scattered candies. But the most disturbing sight wasn't that. It was the tiny shoes on the seat beside the bag, as though a child had torn them off in a rush or been forced to leave them behind. I began to tremble, feeling the blood in my veins freeze. It was as if something or someone had broken the boundary between reality and nightmare, forcing me to feel helpless in the face of the unknown. The fog outside continued to thicken, becoming almost palpable, as though it clung tightly to the carriage. It seemed to seep into the space around me, pouring through the cracks in the windows, suffusing my mind with dread. I was slowly beginning to realize that this train wasn't following any ordinary route. There was something profoundly wrong here, something tainted with an otherworldly horror. There was no light apart from the dim, flickering lamps overhead, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I pressed on, moving through one carriage after another, but everything around me only became stranger. In each carriage, there was something new, abandoned items, forgotten objects, as if everyone had vanished in an instant, leaving only traces of their lives behind. At one point, I found an old vintage photograph lying on a seat. A family, a couple with a child, smiling happily in a summer park. The photograph looked fresh, untouched by time, but as I picked it up, it felt cold, as though I was touching something from another world. Suppressing my rising terror, I continued forward, but something flickered in the corner of my eye. Startled, I saw that someone had scratched words into the wall near the door. Leaning in, I read, "They are coming for you." I swallowed hard, trying to fathom who could have written it and why. Just then, the mechanical voice sounded again from above. "Next station, last station, please prepare to disembark." My heart clenched. The words "last station" felt like a sentence. I stood in silence, feeling the chill rise from my feet to my spine, as though this place was freezing me, rooting me in place. I looked back, but there was no way to retreat. The carriage doors had already closed behind me with an unpleasant, heavy click. I approached the window, straining to see through the dense fog, but there was only impenetrable darkness outside. Soon the train slowed, stopping with a heavy metallic screech, as if it had not ridden on rails, but on long-forgotten tracks, hidden from the rest of the world. Silence enveloped the carriage. I could hear only my own uneven breathing, and the pounding of my heart echoing in this strange emptiness. The doors hissed open, revealing the darkness beyond. A gloomy platform stretched out, like something from another time and space. Old lamps barely lit the area, and it felt as though this place had stood alone for decades. I stepped onto the platform, feeling a slight relief as the worn stone slabs creaked underfoot, already overgrown with strange, twisted roots like gnarled fingers. I wanted to call out to someone, but there wasn't a single living soul in sight. Not a sound, not even the faintest hint of life. This place was utterly dead. A voice deep within, buried in the recesses of my mind, whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The dense fog on the platform thickened, obscuring the outlines of the distant tracks, and it gave off an unpleasant smell, a mix of dampness and rotting leaves, like earth soaked for ages under the shadow of an ancient forest. I walked along the platform, casting wary glances at the train doors, as if they might slam shut at any moment, trapping me here forever. Then I noticed something disturbing. Faint footprints lined the edge of the platform, bare footprints as though someone had scrambled out of the train, panicked, stumbling and falling along the tracks. I followed the prints, hoping to find another living soul. I walked into the darkness, leaving the platform, along the tracks amid what looked like industrial ruins, overgrown with bushes and trees. Suddenly, the footprints stopped abruptly, as if the person who left them had simply vanished into thin air. A chill swept through my body, and I tried to rationalize everything as a mere coincidence. Perhaps some trick of the light or an optical illusion, but there was something else. A faint metallic glint near the footprints. Leaning in, I saw a small locket with a chain, as if someone had dropped it in haste. I picked it up, and a thin layer of half-dried reddish-brown blood clung to my fingers. I tried not to dwell on what it might be. Realizing that every step on this station could be a trap, I decided to return to the train. I turned back toward the platform. The train, inexplicably, was gone. If it had left, I would have heard the engine, as I hadn't gone far from the station. Panic surged in my chest, my breathing quickened, and my fingers clenched into fists. My only way out had vanished. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping someone might hear me, but there was only silence. Parallel to my platform, other tracks stretched, covered in mold and rust, fading into the void. I peered into the dark recesses of the station, trying to spot anything familiar. The calm I was trying to hold on to was dissolving, giving way to terror. Gritting my teeth, I walked along the tracks, knowing there was no way back. In the dim light of the lamps, I saw fresh, barefoot prints appearing in the dust-covered surface, leading deeper into the station. The tracks looked recent, yet there was no one around. The feeling that someone was watching me grew stronger, as though the shadows behind me were alive, ready to grab me the moment I looked away. Maybe minutes passed, but in this thick, distorted space, time had no meaning. The platform wasn't as empty as I'd thought. As I moved forward, the fog began to clear, revealing items scattered on the ground. Lone suitcases, forgotten umbrellas, bags, as if their owners had hurriedly abandoned this place without taking their belongings. One suitcase caught my attention. A bright sticker from some amusement park, faded over time, adorned it. It looked like it had been here for years. I carefully approached and opened it. Inside lay a child's jacket and a stuffed teddy bear. My heart tightened. These were traces of someone who likely hadn't left this station. Cold sweat trickled down my back. Others had been here before, and it seemed none of them ever left. To my side, behind a door leading deeper into the station, a faint sound echoed, as if something small and heavy had fallen to the ground. I turned abruptly, but saw only shadows stirring in the passageway. Approaching cautiously, I noticed a message scrawled in dried blood beside the door. "You will never leave." Suppressing a shiver, I quickened my pace, not knowing what I was searching for, but certain that staying here wasn't an option. I continued forward until the corridor of the platform began to twist, almost as if guiding me deeper. With each step, It felt like the space was closing in, the walls narrowing, shadows thickening, as if something was trapping me. I was almost running when I stumbled upon a staircase leading down into the darkness. The steps were damp and slick, and below lay nothing but impenetrable blackness, but it was my only path. I descended, each step pulling me farther from the platform, leaving me alone with the unknown. At the bottom, I found a massive door secured with an old, rusted lock. I stood before the heavy door, feeling suffocating fear rising in my throat. Perhaps I was simply losing my mind. Maybe all of this was exhaustion, a strange dream, or, as the woman on the phone had said, merely a product of civic responsibility. But deep down, I knew this couldn't be my imagination. The shadows were too real, the smells too thick and clinging, and the strange objects scattered about too unsettling, as if this station was breathing, and its breath was soaked in despair and death. My hands trembled, but I reached for the lock. It was icy to the touch, covered in layers of rust, yet it opened surprisingly easily, as if it had been waiting to grant entry to anyone daring enough to reach for it. Beyond the door lay a long, narrow corridor dimly lit by rare lamps hanging along the walls. The bulbs flickered, barely holding on to their last traces of energy, and I watched shadows writhing, dancing under their faint glow. I moved forward, cautiously stepping on the damp floor, which was slick beneath my feet. Suddenly, on the wall, I noticed the first words, scratched in small, tormented letters. "We are all trapped here." A little farther, another inscription, "They come when we sleep." No explanation was needed. I knew these words had been left by others like me, victims ensnared by this sinister place, trying to warn those who came after. The corridor led me to a circular room, lit by a single, flickering lamp affixed to the ceiling. In the center was an old wooden table, surrounded by scattered papers, personal belongings, photographs. I approached the table, noticing a family photo, a man, a woman, and a small boy, smiling joyfully in front of a house with white walls. But on the back of the photo was written, "We won't return." A lump rose in my throat, but I suppressed it, clenching my fists to keep panic at bay. I began searching the room, but as I turned, I noticed a door on the opposite wall. On it, in large scratched letters, were the words, "Do not enter." I was about to turn and head back to the exit when I heard a faint, desperate whisper behind the door. The voice was barely alive, but it held so much pain and fear that I froze in place. "Please, help." I stood still, uncertain what to do. Every instinct screamed to run, to forget this eerie whisper, this corridor and the lock, but a sense of duty, or perhaps a wild hope that someone might know a way out, compelled me to reach for the handle. I opened the door and found a dark, dreary room. In the corner sat a hunched, trembling figure, their face obscured by shadows. A musty, damp smell emanated from them, as if they had been here for months, maybe years. I moved closer and asked quietly, "Are you all right? Who are you?" They lifted their head, and I saw their eyes, empty, lifeless like extinguished coals. In those eyes I saw my own reflection, and in that moment I realized that this person was dead. I stumbled back, unable to tear my gaze from those vacant, lifeless eyes, which flickered with some faint remnant of, what? Old fear, maybe a long-dead hope. He looked right at me, but there was no awareness, no life, only emptiness, as if this person had remained here, trapped between worlds, lost in an endless void. Suddenly, he started to move, at first slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then his movements became jerky, unnatural, as if invisible strings were pulling at his limbs. It was as though he was coming back to life, but not in any human way, more like a sinister mechanism awakening from a long slumber. "You are here too," he murmured, his voice filled with a muffled echo, as if it were coming from the depths of a grave. Cold shivers ran down my spine. "How did you get here?" The question escaped my lips, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He seemed not to hear me, staring through me, as if he saw something, or someone, lurking behind me. "They always take us," he muttered, "one by one, and no one leaves, no one escapes." His face contorted in a horrifying grimace of pain, and he started to convulse, his body twisting as though something was breaking him from within. I backed away, feeling my blood freeze in my veins. He sprang to his feet, a groan of pure agony escaping his mouth. It took every ounce of strength I had not to scream, yet I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "Run!" he hissed, his voice no longer belonging to a living man. It sounded like a formless, all-consuming whisper emanating from the depths of darkness. I turned and bolted for the exit, hearing a terrible grinding sound behind me, as though something monstrous was tearing after me. I burst out of the room, slammed the door shut, and sprinted back down the corridor, realizing that this place was a trap, a prison designed for those like me. Perhaps everyone who had ever picked up the phone and agreed to a journey to the last station had become a captive of this dark realm where the laws of reality held no sway. Their purpose was still a mystery to me. The corridor, once familiar, began to warp. The walls shuddered, seeming almost alive, narrowing with every second, closing in overhead. Shadows thickened, forming dark figures reaching out, trying to seize and pull me back from where I had fled. Just as I was about to lose hope, a light appeared at the end of the corridor. It was an old metal door leading back to the platform. I rushed toward it without a second thought. The shadows behind me grew restless, as if the very walls were whispering, pulling me deeper. A rising cacophony of whispers, groans, and strange noises filled the air, vibrating with a sinister energy that seemed to pulse around me. I reached the door and slammed my shoulder against it, desperate to break through. At first it wouldn't budge, but then I heard a click, and it finally gave way, letting me back onto the platform. I shut it behind me, feeling the oppressive darkness recede slightly, though the whispers still lingered. It felt as if the darkness itself was trying to seep through. The platform stretched out before me, as empty as before, but the train I'd arrived on was back, sitting in its place, as if it had never left. One detail had changed, adding to my terror. Through the windows, I could see the blurry outlines of passengers, dozens of them. The train was packed to the brim, but they all sat completely still, lined up in perfect rows, like lifeless dolls. Among them were children, elderly people, young couples in bland modern clothing, all seated as if randomly arranged, just to save space. None moved to stow their belongings or settle a child. None spoke. Their cold, vacant faces stared in my direction. Their eyes were empty, like plastic, and their bodies radiated an unbearable cold that penetrated every cell in my body. There was more life in cheap, mass-produced mannequins than in these passengers. Where had they come from? Where were they going? I realized this train could not be my way out. I stood on the platform, unable to take a single step forward. Every instinct screamed that stepping onto that train meant certain death, or worse, eternal entrapment in a nightmare with no escape. But the only door back into the corridors I had fled was already shut behind me, leaving only the faint echo of my own breathing in the oppressive silence. A desperate, almost primal fear surged through me, yet I forced myself to move closer to the train, examining the figures in the windows. They didn't move, but their eyes, cold, empty, utterly devoid of soul, were fixed on me. I looked away, feeling a dark, sticky sensation creep into my mind, as if they weren't just staring, but trying to invade my consciousness, ensnaring it in threads of despair. The train began to move slowly, as if cautious not to disturb its precious cargo. I stood, paralyzed by indecision, torn between running after it or letting it go. I only had seconds to act, and by the time I gathered the nerve, it was already too late. The train slipped away into the night, swallowed by the darkness. Once again, I was alone on the eerily empty platform. Suddenly, behind one of the doors leading into the station, I heard movement. Shaking off my paralysis, I took a deep breath and walked toward the door, pushing it open and stepping through. I found myself on the other side of the platform, surrounded by spectral figures who silently watched me. In their hollow, cold eyes, there was an abyss of despair, as if they had lost everything they once held: hope, will, even self-awareness. I could feel this place draining me, pulling away my strength and my sanity, leaving me a hollow shell like them. I tried to avert my gaze, but they encircled me, closing in from all directions like silent shadows, trapping me. One of them suddenly stepped forward, his movements jerky, as if he no longer controlled his body. Approaching, he lifted his arm and pointed toward the end of the platform, where, through the fog, a shadowy figure became faintly visible, a shape too blurred to discern. Each step I took toward that shadow was echoed by the slow, haunting movements of the other figures following behind me. With every step, the tension in the air grew, the cold intensifying. Finally, I could make out the figure's features, and an icy dread froze me to my core. It was me, a pale, exhausted version of myself, with lifeless eyes and a look of horror etched into my face. In that moment, I knew this was my future self, forever trapped here, a fate awaiting me if I didn't break free. My double looked at me with empty eyes, his form an empty shell mirroring the torment I would soon endure. He extended a hand, and an irresistible pull drew me closer. It was as though this shadow was inviting me to join the endless cycle of despair, a loop where each step would repeat endlessly. Then, a sharp, piercing sound of a diesel engine shattered the oppressive silence. I jolted violently in shock. All the ghostly figures vanished. I was alone on the platform once more. Slowly a train crawled onto the platform, screeching to a halt, filling the air with a nauseating stench of burnt oil and diesel. One of the doors opened near me with a harsh metallic clang. I recoiled, struggling to contain my rising panic. From the doorway, a young man staggered out, his head bloody, his feet bare. Panicked, he didn't even glance at me. Instead, he bolted down the tracks, disappearing into the darkness. I tried to call out to him, but my hoarse voice barely managed a few strangled words before a piercing scream of pain and desperation echoed back, only to be abruptly cut off as if someone had pulled the plug. In a wild attempt to escape, I stepped into the carriage. This time, the interior seemed even darker. Empty seats were coated in grime and dust, and the walls were scrawled with fragments of words and phrases that conveyed horror and agony. Suddenly, a voice came over the speakers, distorted and cold. "Welcome to the last station. Please prepare for the next stop. Perhaps on the next stop, I could find a way out?" The sound was muffled, but it carried a sinister tone, as though the train itself was mocking me, aware that escape was impossible. At that moment, the doors slammed shut, and I felt the train begin to move again, gradually picking up speed. Outside the windows, horrific scenes unfolded. Desolate streets, abandoned buildings, shattered roads. Everything appeared frozen in an apocalyptic horror, trapped in the clutches of darkness. At the far end of the carriage, I saw something moving. A man sat there, his face buried in his hands, quietly sobbing. As I approached, I saw that he was dressed in tattered clothes, his face contorted with fear and despair. He looked up at me, and I realized he too was likely a captive of this train. "You're trapped here too, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was just an ordinary person. I only wanted to go home. But this train, it's not for those looking for a way back." I wanted to ask how long he'd been here, but the words caught in my throat. His eyes held a deep terror, and I understood that he couldn't answer. Time had no meaning here, and each soul caught in this trap lost everything: hope, sanity, memory. We were swallowed by the train, bound to an endless cycle of darkness. The train began to slow again, and I realized that the next station was just another waypoint in this nightmare. When the doors opened once more, I saw before me the same grim platform where my journey had begun. I stepped out, knowing there was no escape, and understood that the station was not just a place, but the very essence of hopelessness. In that moment, I grasped a dreadful truth. This train, this station, this fog, they would keep me here forever, and I would never break free. As I stepped onto the platform, I realized I was trapped in an endless loop where every step forward only brought me back to the same place. The fog thickened, and within it, shadowy figures flickered, too blurred to distinguish. But each time I looked at them, they seemed to retreat, only to reappear somewhere else, watching, waiting. I walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at the tracks stretching into the darkness. Maybe, if I followed them, they'd lead me somewhere that this nightmare would finally end. But every instinct screamed that this too was a trap. Everything in this place existed solely to ensnare those who dared step onto the last station. In a state of despair, I tried to climb back up the stairs I'd descended, but they were no longer there. The platform surrounded me on all sides, a locked cage from which escape was thoroughly barred. The thought of this endless journey's futility sank deeply into my mind, and I felt a growing need to break free from this vicious circle. I had to do something. Then, as I looked out at the empty platform, I noticed something odd. At the farthest, darkest corner of the platform, there was a barely visible door. Strange. I hadn't seen it before, as if it had only just appeared. A faint light seeped from beneath it, almost beckoning me. I headed toward the door, feeling an increasingly strong sense that this could be a way out, an answer, or at least an attempt to understand what was happening here. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the handle, but with clenched teeth, I firmly pressed down. The door opened to reveal a narrow, dark corridor, dimly lit by flickering lights that cast ominous shadows on the walls. The corridor was tight, and the air was stale and damp, as though these walls hadn't seen a visitor in ages. The walls bore the scars of time, marred with patches of rust-like stains. Yet I sensed that there was more here than just old hallways. I walked further, carefully advancing. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and as I moved, I began to hear strange sounds, whispers broken by fragments of phrases. They were words laced with fear and despair, but so indistinct that I couldn't grasp their meaning. Only one word stood out among the rest: help. It was spoken so loudly and clearly that I froze, gripped by a wave of terror. Summoning all my strength, I continued. Soon, the corridor branched into multiple passageways, each veering in a different direction. It felt like I was in a twisted labyrinth, where every turn might lead to a trap or an exit, but which to choose? I turned right at random, then left again, following the faint light glowing in the distance. The sounds grew louder. Echoes of distant suffering seemed to hang in the air, and each step forward seemed to sap a piece of my strength, as if this place was leeching energy from anyone who dared to enter. Finally, I saw something different from the endless turns. A large door with faint, barely visible text across it. Control Center. My heart pounded as I pushed open the door and entered. Beyond was a large, eerily empty room, centered around a massive, dust-covered table. Along one wall were screens and switches. The screens flickered, displaying various views of the platform and the train. I saw different carriages, deserted platforms, and even myself standing in the room. Numb with shock, I approached the screens. The cameras showed not only the current state of the station, but strange scenes. In one carriage, I saw people seated motionless, like lifeless mannequins. Another screen showed a dark tunnel where empty trains vanished into the shadows. This place was clearly designed to monitor every second I spent in this nightmare. I scanned the table, hoping to find any link to the outside world. Then I noticed a small panel with buttons, one labeled Communication. Taking a deep breath, I pressed it, and the speakers in the room crackled to life. At first, there was only static, but then I heard a distorted voice I recognized, the voice of the woman who had invited me on this journey. Mr. Brooks, any attempt to escape is doomed to fail, the voice said, then fell silent. The static grew louder, and amid the garbled noise, I could make out fragments of words. They were all here. No one leaves. Fully realizing that this place was sealed off from the world, I turned back to search for a way out of the room. Then I noticed a folder on the table. Inside were yellowed documents. Among the papers, I found photos of people who had apparently also ended up here. Each photo was stamped with a red mark, found, but nowhere was there any indication of what had happened to them. The folder only stated that they had all boarded the last station. Before I could return to the door, I heard a strange, muffled sound, as though someone was trying to open it from the other side. I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around me. As I realized I wouldn't escape unnoticed, I watched as the handle slowly turned. I was certain it was one of those who had likely discovered this control center before, sent to lure people like me back to the trains and platforms of this endless cycle. Gathering all my courage, I hid behind the table, listening as the door creaked open and someone entered the room. My heart raced as I realized I had to run, not to this illusory control center, but back to the platform to try to break the cycle. When the footsteps drew closer, I bolted for the exit, racing down the corridors without looking back. Bursting onto the platform, I glanced back once and saw that the control center had vanished once again, leaving only the unsettling feeling that it had always been there and yet never existed. Back on the platform, I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The entire system seemed designed to trap me, luring me with phantom promises. But just as despair started to settle in, I noticed a small group of people gathered at the far end of the platform. They looked just as lost as I felt, and a sudden wave of relief washed over me. Could it be that I wasn't alone? As I drew closer, I began to make out their faces. An old man wearing a time-worn hat and a crumpled jacket, a young man who looked formal in a tailored suit, a middle-aged woman with a weary, strained expression, and a teenage girl with disheveled hair and fear etched across her face. They looked at me, their eyes glowing with the same despair and hopelessness that gnawed at me. The old man took a step forward and struggled to speak. You're stuck here too?" I nodded, uncertain of what to say. Their presence was both a comfort and a horror, as I saw reflections of my own fears and despair in each of them. We began talking. One by one, they shared how they'd ended up on this train. The old man went first. "They called me from the municipal center, said I'd been chosen to inspect some old buildings. They talked about the importance of public involvement, how crucial it was for the city's safety." He trailed off, shaking his head bitterly. "I thought I was doing my duty, that I had to do this for others." Next, the young man spoke, his voice trembling. "They assured me that my presence at a volunteer meeting was essential for the city's future, said my skills and contributions would be vital to the safety program. I believed them. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to." The woman brushed her hair nervously, her gaze fixed on the ground. "They lied to me, said I could help with a project for the underprivileged, and then forced me onto this train. Told me it was my civic duty." She clenched her fists, and anger flickered across her face. "Now I understand it was a trap." Last, the girl spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was going to help save the environment. They said they needed volunteers." She choked, hiding her face in her hands. "I wanted to do something meaningful, but now I don't even know where I am." The oppressive sense of injustice and manipulation was unbearable. Each of them had been lured here by a sense of duty, a sense of social responsibility, used as bait to trap them. It was as if the system itself knew how to exploit people's principles and weaknesses, turning them into a deadly snare. "We have to try to find a way out," I said, realizing that, despite our fears, we had to do something. We walked along the platform together, searching the dark corridors, peering into the carriages, each time hoping to see something that might point to an exit. It seemed as if the train was adjusting to us, that every step only led us deeper into its trap. In one of the cars, we saw old, dusty posters urging social responsibility, calls to help the community. Now these slogans seemed like twisted jokes, sinister calls meant to keep us here forever. "This isn't right," the young man muttered, staring intently at one of the posters. "We don't owe this place anything. They lied to us." They started splitting into smaller groups. Some stayed in the last carriage, while others decided to explore the adjacent corridor. We tried to stay in touch, but soon one of us, the young man in the business suit, disappeared. He was nowhere to be found, as if he'd simply vanished, leaving only an eerie void behind. "This place is swallowing us," murmured the old man, his face contorted with fear. "We never should have come here." I tried to calm them, but words were meaningless when, moments later, the woman vanished as well, leaving only a faint whisper, "This place is a trap. Leave." Panic began to overtake us. Only the girl and I remained, and I saw the same terror in her eyes that mirrored my own. We realized that the train wasn't just a mode of transport, but a mechanism designed to lure people in, to harness their fears and bind them here forever. Before he disappeared, the old man turned to me, his eyes full of resignation. "We are all just shadows. We are simply reflections of you, and if you stay, you'll become one of us." With those words, he faded into the mist, leaving me alone. In that moment, I understood that the train and the platform were toying with my mind, that every person I had seen was a projection of my own fears and doubts. The darkness around me deepened, and I felt cold shadows closing in. I was alone, surrounded by ghostly images of those who, like me, had once become prisoners of this place. Wandering through the familiar corridor, I once again found the crazed young man who looked half dead. He lay on some rags, staring blankly at the ceiling. I called to him softly a few times, but he didn't respond. I crouched beside him for a moment, and suddenly, without thinking, I said, "Hey, did you know Atlanta got knocked out of the playoffs?" As his vacant eyes slowly turned to meet mine, his chest shook with sobs full of despair and pain. "Really? How'd it happen?" It seemed he'd seen me before, just hadn't paid attention, probably thinking I was another hallucination. I quickly recounted how I'd listened to the game while at work, and he drank in every word like a man starved. When I finished, while he was still able to hear me, I asked, "Is there any chance of getting out of here?" I took out the pendant I'd found when I first arrived on the platform and showed it to him. He flinched, giving me another look over before painfully propping himself up on his elbows. He beckoned me closer with a finger. I leaned down, and he seized me by the collar, pulling me near and whispering rapidly, "Third exit, turn left, hall, third row, down on the tracks, near the storm drain." He grabbed the pendant from my hands, examining it, scraping a finger over it. He seemed unable to believe it was a real object, as if he hadn't seen anything from the real world in ages. I started to leave, but he tugged at my pant leg. "Wait," he rasped, extending his clenched fist. He seemed to have something for me. I held out my hand, and he passed me a smooth, paper-like object. "Hide it until the right time. I won't need it," he said, settling back into the rags. His legs ended in stumps. "Stepped on a mine in Afghanistan," he added with a sad smile. "They'll spot me right away, but you've got a chance. Hide it. They're watching." I nodded, stashing it in my pocket without looking. I hurried along the path he'd described. When I emerged back onto the platform, the scene was familiar, as if I'd never left. But this time, something was off. The platform was different. The same motionless, passive passengers stood in dense lines, waiting to board like mannequins in a factory. But now their gazes weren't on me. They were fixed somewhere beyond the foggy horizon. It was as if they were waiting for something. They ignored me, standing in silent rows that trailed back through the station doors. Then I heard it, a sound, distant at first, but soon growing louder, the rhythmic pounding of steel wheels against rail joints, drawing nearer with each second. It was a new train. It emerged from the fog, rolling slowly toward the platform. This one looked newer. I guessed that whoever ran this place took better care of those they sent back. I knew I didn't have much time. I sprinted along the route the soldier had described. Stepping down onto the tracks of another platform, I noticed something resembling a body lying there, but it was one of those mannequins that the platform's operators sent back to the real world. It was broken, with a fractured arm, its material hardened like air-dry clay. I rolled it over, finding that its face was a solid porcelain piece, like a Venetian mask. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the slip the soldier had given me. I half expected it to be a ticket, but it was a store tag, complete with a barcode, model number, and series. I quickly dressed in the mannequin's clothes, clipped on the tag, and positioned the mask over my face. It smelled of clinical sterility. Fortunately, the mannequin had a hoodie, and I pulled the strings tight to secure the mask. Returning to the platform where loading continued, I slipped into the back of the line, which swayed slightly as it moved into the train, each figure seemingly aware that this train would take them to their final destination. One by one, they disappeared into its depths, becoming part of the eerie procession. I tried to move in sync, holding my breath, knowing that this might be my last chance to escape. Whatever it was, this new train felt different from the one I'd arrived on. Perhaps it would take me away, maybe to another world, or even back. The passengers took their seats, arranging themselves evenly in the car. Left, right, left, right. I did my best to follow suit, settling between a man with prison tattoos, possibly carrying a gun under his hoodie, and a girl dressed in Balenciaga with an expensive handbag. Neither of them reacted to my presence. Once seated, we remained in complete silence, eyes cast to the floor. I followed their lead. A sharp sound, like the abrupt halt of a factory conveyor, pierced the air. I froze, bracing for the worst. The noise moved quickly down the aisle. I kept my head low, fearing they'd notice my cracked mask. The sound grew closer. It stopped right next to me. Sweat dripped down my face beneath the mask. Suddenly, something yanked the tag from my clothing, tearing it away. The sound faded into the distance. It turned out to be the noise of tags being torn off, preparing this batch of almost humans to be released into the world. The sound finally disappeared, and the train lurched forward. Paralyzed with fear, I stayed hunched over as the wheels rolled steadily over the rails. After a long while, the train began to slow, and I risked lifting my head a little. The mannequins sat as before, staring blankly ahead. A soft chime rang out, like the cabin signal in an airplane, and a green light flickered on as the mannequins sprang to life. They started acting almost like real people. Across from me sat a family who had just been lifeless a moment ago, but now the wife was in mid-story, complaining to her husband about some witch named Margaret from work, while the child picked his nose. As the train slowed, the almost people filed out onto a platform, bustling with other trains and passengers. Everything seemed normal. As I stepped off, I risked removing the mask. No one paid any attention. Getting into a cab, I glanced back at the station and saw the family from the train again. They were sitting in a McDonald's with a massive order, 2 cheeseburgers each, fries, nuggets, and ice cream. They laughed and seemed so ordinary, but I knew the truth. The real people, those who notice a broken stoplight or respond to a call of civic duty, are being replaced by compliant, regulated porcelain mannequins with tags, production date, composition, price. A mass production of consumers who vote just the way they're told. My cab pulled away smoothly, the street alive with people and cars. "Where to?" asked the driver, his tone brisk, almost excessively cheerful without turning around. "Anywhere far from here," I muttered, still trying to grasp the fact that I was finally free. Only a few seconds later, I noticed the driver's face in the rear-view mirror, the same face I saw every day in my own reflection. He looked just like me, only a little younger, newer, with a tense but overly friendly expression. "We look a lot alike," I muttered, feeling my heart pound wildly. The driver laughed, too loudly, almost theatrically, then turned around with a wide smile. "Alike? You must be confusing me with someone else, pal," he replied, his tone so cheerful it made my skin crawl. "Just a coincidence. They say everyone has a double, you know." I froze, feeling panic creep in. His smile was friendly, almost too positive, but behind it lay an unsettling emptiness. "Listen, that's impossible," I managed to say, though my voice betrayed a tremor. "We can't just be alike." The driver shook his head, his tone excessively upbeat, as if oblivious to the tension in my words. "Oh, don't worry about it. It's just a coincidence. Life's full of surprises, right?" He smiled again, his grin stretched too wide, like an actor who didn't know how to appear sincere. "Honestly, it's so nice to meet a good person. The world's full of worries and fears, but you just have to enjoy the moment." The more he talked, the stronger the feeling grew that I'd stepped back into a trap. His unnatural cheerfulness became more repulsive, reminding me of all the terrifying encounters on the platform. Unable to bear it, I made a desperate move, reaching forward to touch his shoulder, hoping to ground myself in some kind of reality within this absurdity. "Hey, pal, everything's fine." His voice grew even brighter, more artificial, as if purposely dodging everything I said. "Just sit back, relax. Everything's under control. We're all created in his image, right?" Flashbacks of that shattered porcelain mannequin face flooded my mind, overwhelmed by his hollow reassurance. I grabbed his shoulder, my panic turning to anger as I shook him, shouting for him to stop. At first he froze, then tried to pull away, unwilling to let his friendly facade crack. Without fully realizing what I was doing, my hands tightened around his neck. In a frenzy of terror and rage, I squeezed until he stopped resisting, and we crashed into a car stopped at the light ahead. When I came to, I saw his body lying motionless beside me. To my shock, he wasn't made of porcelain. Around us, people gathered. Sirens blared. I didn't resist when they pulled me from the car, cuffing me. My mind was numb, and fear had taken such deep root in me that I couldn't tell reality from illusion. At the police station, they placed me in a cell. An officer approached the door, speaking to me as if he'd seen me here many times before. "Think you're the only one who's ended up here," he said with chilling calm. "They know how to reach you, and every time you try to get out, the cycle just starts again." He looked straight at me with eyes that held no empathy, no anger, only a kind of cold indifference that was more frightening than either. He pulled something from his pocket and began spinning it on his finger. It was the very tag that had helped me escape. So fight all you want, but believe me, the system will always find you. Inside, everything in me clenched, but I realized that this was only the beginning of my fight. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.